The stuffy July evening in mid-16th century Rome smells not only of the stagnant waters of the Tiber and the dust of ancient ruins, but also of a heavy, sticky premonition of a tectonic shift in the very structure of human society. If we could transport ourselves to the riverbank near the Porticus Octavii on July 14, 1555, we would hear not only the cries of seagulls, but also the sharp dry of hammers echoing off the stones of the theater of Marcellus. This was not the usual urban construction to which Renaissance Romans were accustomed. This was the erection of physical boundaries that would stand for over 300 years, shaping the landscape not only of the city, but also of the European consciousness. At sunset on that day, by order of a man whose name would soon become synonymous with stern, almost granite inflexibility, heavy wooden gates closed for the first time, separating one part of the city's population from another. At that moment, the Roman ghetto was officially born, and with it, a new, frighteningly systemic reality of segregation, enshrined in the text of the papal bull titled Cum nimis absurdum. Before we begin to dissect this historical festering wound and explore the mechanisms that led to the creation of one of the most closed zones in European history, I urge you to become full participants in our investigation. Subscribe to this channel, give a thumbs up, and be sure to share this video with those who are not afraid to face the uncomfortable facts of the past. Your support is the fuel that allows us to conduct a deep audit of history, delving into archives where the lazy eye of the layman rarely ventures. We are accustomed to considering the 16th century a time of the High Renaissance, the era of Michelangelo and Raphael, a time when the human spirit, it seemed, broke the chains of medieval dogmatism. However, I propose to look at the logistics of this Golden Age from a different, darker angle. In that year, Gian Pietro Carafa ascended to the papal throne, taking the name Paul IV. He was 79 years old, an age when most people seek peace, but Carafa was of a different mold. He was an archetypal, grim elder, whose gaze was turned not to the future, but to an idealized past, surgically cleansed of any impurity. His personal animosity towards all forms of religious or intellectual dissidence was forged over decades of service in the structures of the Inquisition, which he himself reorganized along the Spanish model. Here we see a fatal error of many biographers who try to attribute his actions to simple senile stubbornness or personal malice. In reality, an analysis of his strategy reveals a terrifying, almost mathematical rationality. He didn't just hate, he designed a social order where every element of the mechanism had to know its rigidly allotted and isolated place. The official Vatican version of the time states that the bull was a necessary response to the needs of protecting the faith and strengthening the moral foundations of Christendom in the face of the threat of the Reformation. However, I have serious doubts about this smooth interpretation. If we examine the economic landscape of Rome in those years, it becomes clear that the isolation of the Jewish community was not so much a theological act as an attempt to gain total control over the financial flows of a city that was literally suffocating from debt, inflation, and endless wars. The title of the document, Cum nimis absurdum, translates as, Since it is exceedingly absurd. The title itself sets the tone for intellectual and legal aggression. The very existence of Jews in close proximity to Christians as full-fledged neighbors was declared absurd. This was not just a decree, it was a manifesto for the exclusion from human space of those who did not fit into Carafa's rigid vertical of power. Look closely at the topographical details of this decision. Paul IV prescribed that all Jews of Rome relocate to a single quarter, which had a strictly limited number of entrances and exits. But few noticed that the ghetto's location was chosen with truly Jesuitical calculation. This was the Sant'Angelo district, the lowest and most disadvantaged point of the city, which the Tiber flooded on average 5 to 6 times a decade. The water rose 2 and sometimes even 3 meters, turning the lower floors of dwellings into rotting, silt-filled, disease-ridden traps. Historians still debate the reasons for such a choice, often suggesting it was the only undeveloped land in the center. But I propose viewing it as an element of conscious psychological pressure. It was a tangible demonstration that the lives of those who did not share the official church doctrine were literally not worth even the dry ground beneath their feet. Let's delve into the daily life of this space to feel its texture. Inside the newly erected walls, time seemed to slow down and thicken, but the density of life became unbearable. Imagine a space of only a few hectares where over 4,000 people were confined. Since expanding horizontally was forbidden by law, houses began to grow upwards. Buildings were added floor by floor, creating shaky, collapse-threatening structures that almost completely obscured the sky above the narrow alleys. Even on the sunniest noon, a perpetual twilight reigned at ground level. The air in the ghetto was always heavy, specific, permeated with the smell of fish fried in cheap oil, old woolen fabric, and the dampness emanating from the perpetually wet foundation stones. It is here that we encounter one of the bull's harshest provisions, the total restriction of professions. Under penalty of severe punishment, Jews were forbidden to engage in anything other than trading used goods, old clothes, and rags. Thus, in the very heart of Rome, the famous Stracciaria, the rag market, was born. I propose viewing this not merely as an attempt at economic strangulation, but as a metaphorical deprivation of the future. People were only allowed to work with what had already outlived its purpose, with the material refuse of history. Few know that even the windows in ghetto houses facing the Christian side of the city had to be bricked up or covered with dense shields, so that residents could not glimpse the world from which they had been excluded. In the headquarters of the Inquisition during these days, there was the smell of ink and fresh sealing wax. The bureaucratic machine worked flawlessly, cementing disenfranchisement on paper. However, the most striking and psychologically oppressive element of the bull was the introduction of mandatory distinguishing marks. This decision by Paul IV can be considered a prototype of the darkest practices of the 20th century. Men had to wear bright yellow hats, and women wore scarves of the same shade. In official documents, this was explained by the need to avoid sinful mingling, so that any believer could always unmistakably identify a member of the community. But here we see the work of another powerful archetype, the stranger, who must be marked to make him as vulnerable as possible and strip him of his anonymity in the crowd. In the mid-16th century, yellow in the European mind was not associated with gold or sunlight. It was the color of sulfur, the color of betrayal, disease, and madness. Wearing such a hat turned any respected merchant or scholar into a living target for ridicule, spitting, and physical aggression the very second he left the ghetto for community affairs. It is interesting that precisely in this period, historical sources begin to diverge radically in their description of events. Vatican chronicles, written by court chroniclers, paint a picture of the triumph of divine order and the joy of citizens at the cleansing of the streets. At the same time, personal diaries of Roman officials, notes from Venetian ambassadors, and secret dispatches from diplomats are full of descriptions of chaos and economic depression. There is a persistent theory that the Jewish community of Rome, realizing the scale of the impending catastrophe, tried to enter into negotiations with the pontiff. There is talk of an enormous sum for those times, 40,000 gold ducats, which the community leaders were willing to pay into the papal treasury for the annulment or at least a significant mitigation of the bull's provisions. But Paul IV, true to his psychological portrait of a fanatic, categorically refused. For him, the purity of ideological construct was more important than any gold, which in itself was an anomaly for Roman pontiffs of that era, usually very pragmatic in financial matters. Here we encounter a paradox. A man who sought to strengthen the church's power actually undermined the economic base of his own city by expelling from active circulation those who provided a significant part of Rome's trade and logistical connections. At this point in our narrative, I want to pause and ask you a question that military historians and documentarians often avoid. How would you have acted if you had found yourself within these walls? When your world suddenly shrinks to the size of a few dirty alleys and your right to a profession is reduced to reselling rags? Would you have sought ways to escape, risking everything? Or would you have focused on creating the most comfortable environment within this storage cell? Write in the comments which path seems more logical to you in conditions of total systemic isolation. Your reflections are extremely important for understanding how the human psyche adapts to conditions that seem incompatible with dignity. Analyzing the internal conflict of this era, we see a head-on collision of two completely different value systems. On one side, there was the rigid, hierarchical, almost military structure of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which saw social and religious uniformity as the only guarantee of salvation for the state and soul. On the other side, there was a flexible culture based on horizontal family ties, literacy, and intellectual labor, which was forced to invent new ways of survival on the fly in conditions of absolute unfreedom. Paul IV probably sincerely believed that he was creating a temporary measure, a kind of quarantine, which would inevitably lead to a mass renunciation of people's identity in favor of the official religion. But he made the classic mistake of a tyrant. He did not take into account that external pressure, in 9 out of 10 cases, only strengthens the internal cohesion of the persecuted group. The Ghetto, conceived as a prison and a place of humiliation, in the long run turned into a true fortress of spirit and unique culture. Life within the Ghetto gave rise to astonishing social phenomena. Since there was a catastrophic lack of free space and the population continued to grow, a unique legal right emerged: jus gazzaga. This was the right to own a specific place or part of a house in the Ghetto, which could be inherited, sold, and even serve as a dowry for brides. The most ironic aspect was that formally all land and buildings in the quarter belonged to Christian owners, to whom the Jews were obliged to pay a fixed rent. But the owners had no right to evict tenants as long as they paid. Thus, within a system of disenfranchisement, a complex internal system of rights arose, which was recognized even by external courts. The micro-history of that time has preserved details for us that allow us to almost physically feel that era. We know, for example, that in the Inquisition headquarters, during working hours when clarifications to the bull were being made, there was always the smell of strong vinegar. It was believed to protect against diseases that supposedly could come from the unclean quarters. We know the brand of watches and the clothing preferences of the high prelates who signed decrees on the confiscation of books. And at the same time, in the Ghetto, a unique cuisine was born: cucina ebraica romana. Limited in resources, the ghetto residents learned to turn the cheapest products into masterpieces. The famous Jewish-style artichokes, fried in boiling oil until they resembled a golden, crispy rose, became a symbol of that time. It was a gastronomic victory over poverty. Even from a simple vegetable, people managed to create something beautiful, while outside the windows, guards in coarse boots checked the bolts on the gates. The personal ambitions of Paul IV led to Rome, once an open cosmopolitan center of the ancient and Christian world, rapidly transforming into a city of suspicion and fear. His Inquisition spared no one. Even cardinals and close associates of the pontiff fell under suspicion. The bull cum nimis absurdum was only the first stone in the foundation of the wall that began to grow between people across Europe. Historians often debate how direct the connection was between Carafa's actions and the tragedies of the mid-20th century. I am inclined to believe that here we are dealing not just with a historical coincidence, but with the creation of a fundamental legal and, more importantly, psychological precedent. When a certain group of people is officially, at the highest legal level, declared absurd in their right to equal existence, the path to any further forms of dehumanization becomes frighteningly short and logically justified. Few notice another technical aspect of this story, which usually escapes the attention of researchers. The text of the bull was printed on high-quality goat parchment, a material that under ideal conditions can last for more than 1,000 years. And indeed, the influence of this document proved incredibly durable, outliving its author by hundreds of years. Even after Paul IV ended his earthly journey in August 1559, and the jubilant Roman people, hating the harsh pope, broke into the Inquisition prisons and threw his statue into the murky waters of the Tiber, the provisions of the bull were not annulled. On the contrary, subsequent pontiffs, even those considered liberals, only confirmed and sometimes tightened its conditions. One of Carafa's successors went even further, forbidding Jews from owning any libraries and authorizing the mass seizure and destruction of philosophical and religious treatises. We see here an attempt not just at physical isolation within four walls, but also the mental castration of an entire community, an endeavor to eradicate the very possibility of intellectual dialogue. The transformation of this situation began only 3 centuries later, and this turning point was full of drama and paradoxes. In the 18th century, as the ideas of the Enlightenment began, like thin streams of water, to seep through the thick walls of the ghetto, an astonishing generation of young people emerged. Secretly, by the light of candle stubs, they studied medicine, natural sciences, and law. They used Latin, the language of their persecutors, to access knowledge that was officially closed to them. This was a true, quiet rebellion of intellect against dogma. However, Rome's official system remained an unyielding fortress until an external, irresistible force shattered the old order. In 1798, French revolutionary troops under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious generals entered the Eternal City. Soldiers in blue uniforms inspired by the ideals of liberty and equality did not wait for long diplomatic negotiations. They simply rolled cannons up to the ghetto gates and blasted them off their hinges to the enthusiastic cheers of the crowd. It was a moment of brief, dazzling triumph for humanity over medieval prejudice. But history is a capricious lady. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1814, Pope Pius VII returned to the Vatican. And, what seems absolutely unthinkable to us today, his first act was to order the restoration of the walls and to once again herd people into the cramped confines of the ghetto. Here we receive one of history's most important and bitter lessons. Progress is not a straight line, always moving upwards. The ideas of segregation, division, and exclusion possess a frightening, almost mystical tenacity. They are always ready to return as soon as society lowers its guard or faces a crisis. The ghetto in Rome existed for a total of 315 years. Consider that number. 12 or 13 generations of people who were born, started families, raised children, and completed their life's journey in a space that was limited by the will of one fanatical old man and a few pages of legal text. The culmination of this long, drawn-out drama only came on September 20th, 1870. On that day, the troops of a unifying Italy, led by General Cadorna, breached the city wall at the Porta Pia. When the Italian bersaglieri, in their feathered hats, entered the city, it meant not only the end of the Pope's secular power over Rome, but also the definitive demise of the very idea of the ghetto as a state institution. The last ghetto in Western Europe was officially and forever abolished. The residents of the community received full citizenship, the right to vote, and the ability to settle wherever they wished. It seemed that the shadow of the bull, cum nimis absurdum, had finally dissolved into the mists of the 19th century, giving way to a new era of progress. However, the resonance of those events is clearly felt even today, in the mid-20s of the 21st century. Why is it so important for us to remember the yellow hats and bricked-up windows of the 16th century? Because it was then, in the quiet of the Vatican offices, that the mechanism of dehumanization through visual markers and spatial isolation was meticulously developed and launched. Analyzing the psychological portrait of that society, we understand how easily the fear of change and the terror of losing control transform into organized aggression against those who are other. Paul IV was not insane in a clinical sense. He was an effective manager of a system that chose the path of exclusion instead of integration. Today, as we walk through the Sant'Angelo district, we see cozy cafe terraces, expensive boutiques, and crowds of tourists from all over the world. But if you pause for a moment and look closely at the ancient stones at the base of the portico of Octavia, you can still discern the deep grooves and marks where heavy forged bolts of the main gates once fit. These scars on the body of the city are not just archaeological details. They remind us how dangerous and easy it is to destroy the fragile fabric of social peace, and how incredibly difficult, sometimes at the cost of several generations' lives, it is to then restore it. The lesson of the Bull of 1555 is that any ideology built on hatred and the division of people into absurd and correct is ultimately doomed to historical defeat. But the price of this lesson always turns out to be exorbitantly high. I urge you to look at our current surroundings through the prism of this investigation. Are we not, right now, erecting new, invisible, yet no less sturdy walls in our minds and in the digital space? Are we not trying to affix modern equivalents of yellow badges on those who do not fit into our notions of the correct world order? The history of the Roman ghetto is not just a dusty tale of old popes and forgotten laws. It is a living warning that the archetype of the Inquisitor awakens in each of us the very second we deny another person the right to complexity, depth, and otherness. Concluding our journey through the narrow, history-haunted alleys of Rome, we inevitably return to that very July evening of 1555. The same smell of the Tiber, the same long, unsettling shadows from the columns of the ancient theater. But now, you and I are armed with knowledge. We understand that behind the dry lines of Latin text, lay a colossal mechanism that determined the fates of thousands of people for 3 centuries. We have realized that the true absurdity, highlighted in the title of the papal bull, lay not in the coexistence of different cultures, but in the self-assured attempt of one person to declare this coexistence a mistake. Let this conclusion be not just a fact for you, but a tool for analyzing modernity. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and remember, freedom is not only the absence of physical gates and walls, it is primarily the inner courage to see every person as your equal, regardless of the color of their hat and the language in which they address eternity. History continues, and only our choice determines what walls we will build tomorrow. Walls of isolation or bridges of understanding. See you in new episodes, where we will continue to peel back the layers of dust from the most fascinating and instructive pages of our shared past.